This is character training, he used to say when he would tuck me into that wooden box every night starting when I was 6 years old. By the time I turned 10, I started suffocating in there, but he just placed a heavy book on top and told me to learn how to control my panic. Yesterday, I found his notes hidden in the basement, and I realized that Coffin had been purchased a full year before I was even born. Growing up, I thought every kid had a bedtime routine that involved climbing into a wooden box. The way my father explained it made it sound almost normal, like brushing your teeth or saying prayers. He would carry me down to the basement every evening at exactly 8:30, help me settle into the silk-lined interior, and then close the lid with a soft thud that still echoes in my nightmares today. The first few years weren't so bad. I was small enough that the space felt cozy rather than confining, and the darkness became as familiar as my own bedroom. My father had drilled tiny holes in the wood for air circulation, though I wouldn't understand the significance of that detail for many years. He would sit beside the coffin for the first hour, sometimes humming old military songs or tapping rhythms on the wood to let me know he was still there. But as I grew older and bigger, the nightly ritual became increasingly terrifying. My shoulders would press against the sides, my knees would bump the top when I tried to shift position, and the weight of claustrophobia would settle on my chest like a living thing. The panic attack started around my 9th birthday, violent episodes where I would scratch at the wood until my fingernails bled and hyperventilate until I passed out. My father's response was always the same measured approach. He would place something heavy on the lid to prevent me from pushing it open and remind me that controlling fear was the most important skill a person could develop. Sometimes it was a dictionary, sometimes a toolbox. Once it was a stack of concrete blocks that must have weighed 50 pounds. The message was clear. There was no escape until morning, so I better learn to cope. School became my refuge, though I could never explain to teachers why I fell asleep in class or why I flinched whenever anyone mentioned anything related to death or burial. Other kids would joke about being afraid of monsters under the bed, and I would force a laugh while thinking about how I spent every night inside what looked like a monster's mouth. The physical discomfort was nothing compared to the psychological impact. I developed an intense fear of enclosed spaces that made elevators, closets, and even crowded rooms feel like torture chambers. I couldn't watch movies with burial scenes, couldn't visit funeral homes, couldn't even handle the idea of sleeping under thick blankets without panic setting in. My father seemed genuinely proud of my progress, though I couldn't understand what progress he was measuring. He would make notes in a leather journal after each night, writing detailed observations about my behavior, my breathing patterns, how long it took me to stop crying. He treated it like a scientific experiment, which in retrospect, I suppose it was. When I turned 12, he started making the sessions longer. Instead of the usual 8 hours from bedtime to morning, he would leave me in there for 10, sometimes 12 hours at a stretch. Weekend sessions could last entire days, with only brief breaks for meals and bathroom visits. He called these extended periods intensive training, and he seemed to believe they were crucial for my development. The isolation was the worst part. Hours and hours of complete darkness and silence, with nothing but my own thoughts for company. I would count heartbeats, recite everything I could remember from school, make up elaborate stories in my head just to keep from losing my mind. Sometimes I would wake up not knowing if minutes or hours had passed, completely disoriented and gasping for air that always seemed insufficient. By my teenage years, I had developed what my father called impressive emotional control. I could lie motionless in that coffin for hours without crying, without scratching at the walls, without begging to be let out. He saw this as success, but I knew it was just the numbness that comes when your mind shuts down to protect itself from trauma it can't process. I never brought friends home because explaining the basement setup was impossible. How do you tell someone that your father believes sleeping in a coffin builds character? How do you justify the fact that this has been your normal for over a decade? The few times other kids came over, I would make excuses to keep them upstairs, terrified they might discover my nightly routine and realize just how broken my family really was. College offered the first real escape from the coffin, though my father made it clear he considered my education a temporary interruption to my training. He would call every few weeks to check on my progress, asking detailed questions about whether I was maintaining the discipline he had worked so hard to instill. I would lie and tell him I was practicing meditation and breathing exercises, anything to avoid admitting how grateful I was to sleep in a normal bed. After graduation, I moved across the country, putting as much distance as possible between myself and that basement. I built a life that looked normal from the outside, but the damage was already done. Relationships were impossible because intimacy required vulnerability, and vulnerability felt too much like being trapped in that box. I couldn't sleep in complete darkness, couldn't handle small spaces, couldn't even attend funerals without having panic attacks. My father and I maintained minimal contact over the years. He would send birthday cards with brief notes about staying strong and maintaining focus, but we never talked about the coffin directly. It was like we had both agreed to pretend those years had never happened, even though they shaped every aspect of who I became. Then last month, I got the call that he had died suddenly of a heart attack. The funeral arrangements fell to me as his only surviving family, which meant returning to the house I had spent 15 years avoiding. Walking back into that basement felt like stepping into a tomb, and seeing the coffin still sitting in the same spot made my hand shake so badly I could barely hold my phone. But I knew I had to face it eventually. All those years of wondering why, all those sleepless nights trying to understand what could have motivated a father to put his child through such systematic torture, and now I might finally get some answers. I started going through his belongings methodically, looking for anything that might explain his twisted logic. The breakthrough came when I was clearing out a storage room behind the basement stairs. Hidden behind boxes of military gear and old photographs, I found a metal filing cabinet I had never noticed before. Inside were dozens of journals, medical reports, and official-looking documents that painted a picture of my father's life I had never imagined. The first journal was dated 1998, a year before I was born. The entries were written in my father's careful handwriting, but the content was unlike anything I had ever seen from him. He wrote about classified military operations, about experiments conducted on soldiers to test their psychological limits, about projects that pushed the boundaries of what the human mind could endure. He had been part of something called Project Threshold, a program designed to create soldiers who could function normally in extreme stress situations. The theory was that by gradually exposing subjects to controlled trauma, they could build immunity to fear and panic that would make them more effective in combat. The methods included sensory deprivation, simulated burial, and what the documents called death rehearsal training. My father had volunteered for the program along with his closest friend and military partner. They spent months undergoing increasingly intense psychological conditioning, including extended periods in coffin-like chambers designed to simulate burial and near-death experiences. The goal was to reach a point where the fear of death no longer had any power over them, where they could face any situation with complete emotional control. But the program had gone wrong in ways that the military had covered up. Several participants had suffered complete psychological breaks, and others had developed what the reports called pathological fearlessness that made them dangerous both to themselves and others. My father's partner had been one of the casualties, though the details were heavily redacted in the official documents. According to the journals, the final phase of Project Threshold had taken place during a deployment overseas. My father and his partner had been sent to investigate reports of unusual artifacts that local forces believed might have psychological effects on anyone who came into contact with them. The mission had been classified at the highest levels, and even the journal entries about it were written in a kind of code that took me hours to decipher. They had found something in an ancient burial site, something that my father described as a stone tablet covered in symbols that seemed to move and shift when you looked at them directly. The inscription, when finally translated, contained what appeared to be instructions for achieving immortality through death simulation. The text claimed that anyone who could master the experience of dying without actually dying would transcend normal human limitations. My father's partner had insisted on testing the artifact's claims immediately. He had constructed a crude burial chamber using local materials and spent an entire night sealed inside, following the ritual described on the stone. When my father opened the chamber the next morning, his partner was dead with no apparent cause, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. Rather than reporting the incident through proper channels, my father had smuggled the stone tablet back to the United States. He became obsessed with the idea that the ritual had failed because his partner hadn't been properly prepared, hadn't developed sufficient immunity to the fear of death through gradual conditioning. He spent months researching historical accounts of similar artifacts and became convinced that the key was systematic desensitization starting from childhood. By the time I was born, he had already purchased the coffin and designed what he believed would be a decades-long training program. Every night I spent in that box was part of his plan to prepare me for what he called the final trial, the moment when I would spend 24 hours in complete burial simulation and emerge with the immortality the ancient text promised. The later journal entries revealed the full scope of his delusion. He had convinced himself that the nightly coffin sessions were gradually building my tolerance for the death experience, that each panic attack I survived made me stronger and more capable of handling the ultimate test. He tracked every detail of my responses, measuring my progress toward what he believed would be my transformation into something beyond normal human limitations. The most disturbing entries came from my teenage years, when he started planning for the final phase of my training. He had calculated that by my 18th birthday, I would have accumulated enough simulated death experience to survive the complete ritual. He had even prepared a sealed burial chamber in a remote location, designed to replicate the conditions described in the ancient text as closely as possible. But then I had left for college, and his carefully laid plans had been disrupted. The journal entries from those years showed increasing frustration and desperation as he realized I was slipping away from his control. He had considered various ways to force me back into the program, but something had held him back. Perhaps some small part of him had recognized how damaged I already was, or maybe he had finally started to question his own sanity. The final entries were written just weeks before his death, and they painted a picture of a man consumed by regret and obsession in equal measure. He wrote about watching me from a distance, about seeing how the years of Coffin training had affected my ability to live a normal life. For the first time, he seemed to understand that his experiment had been a form of torture rather than preparation for greatness. But even his regret was twisted by his delusions. He wrote about considering one final attempt to complete the ritual himself, about whether the years of planning and preparation had given him enough insight to succeed where his partner had failed. The last entry was dated 3 days before his heart attack, and it contained detailed instructions for finding the stone tablet and the burial chamber he had prepared. Update 1. Reading those journals felt like watching my entire childhood recontextualized in the worst possible way. Every memory I had of trying to please my father, every moment I had interpreted as his misguided attempt to make me stronger, had actually been part of an elaborate plan to use me as a test subject for his occult experiment. The Coffin hadn't been character building at all. It had been conditioning for what he believed would ultimately be my death and resurrection. I spent the next several days going through every document in that filing cabinet, trying to piece together the full timeline of my father's descent into obsession. The early military records painted a picture of a decorated soldier who had volunteered for increasingly dangerous assignments, always pushing himself to prove that he could handle whatever the military threw at him. Project Threshold had been the logical culmination of that drive, the ultimate test of his psychological limits. But the overseas deployment had broken something fundamental in him. The journals from immediately after his partner's death showed signs of what any reasonable person would recognize as severe trauma and possibly psychosis. Instead of seeking help or reporting what had happened, he had convinced himself that his partner's death proved the ritual's power rather than its danger. In his mind, the failure had been one of preparation rather than the fundamental impossibility of the task. The stone tablet itself was still hidden in the house, wrapped in military-grade storage materials and locked in a safe behind a false wall in his bedroom. When I finally worked up the courage to examine it, I found a piece of carved rock that looked ancient but unremarkable. The symbols my father had described as moving and shifting appeared to be simple geometric patterns, the kind of decorative carving you might find on any old building or monument. But holding the tablet gave me an overwhelming sense of unease that had nothing to do with its supposed supernatural properties. This chunk of rock had been the foundation of my father's delusion, the justification he had used for putting me through years of systematic psychological torture. Whether or not it actually had any power beyond the human capacity for self-deception, it had destroyed 2 lives and nearly claimed a third. I also found the location of the burial chamber he had prepared for my final trial. It was on a piece of remote property he had purchased under a false name, accessible only by a hiking trail that required several hours of walking through dense forest. The deed and property maps were hidden with the tablet, along with detailed construction plans showing how he had built an underground chamber designed to replicate ancient burial practices. Part of me felt compelled to visit the site, to see firsthand the place where my father had planned to complete his experiment. But a larger part recognized that desire as the same kind of morbid curiosity that had driven him to test the tablet's claims in the first place. Some mysteries are better left unexplored, some questions better left unanswered. Instead, I focused on the practical matter of deciding what to do with everything I had discovered. The military documents were probably still classified, and revealing them publicly could create legal problems I wasn't prepared to handle. The stone tablet, whether genuinely ancient or an elaborate fake, felt too dangerous to keep but too significant to simply throw away. I ended up contacting a professor of archaeology at a nearby university, someone with expertise in ancient Middle Eastern artifacts who might be able to provide some objective analysis. I didn't mention the supernatural claims or my father's obsession, just explained that I had inherited what appeared to be an old carved stone and wanted to know more about its origins. The professor was intrigued enough to examine the tablet in person, and his analysis provided some unexpected insights. The carving style and stone composition were consistent with artifacts from ancient Mesopotamia, specifically from burial sites dating to around 2000 BCE. The symbols were a form of cuneiform writing that had been used for religious and ceremonial purposes, often in contexts related to death rituals and afterlife beliefs. But the specific text on the tablet was unlike anything in the established archaeological record. The professor described it as either an extremely rare example of a previously unknown burial cult or a modern creation designed to look authentic. Either way, he was fascinated enough to want to study it further and possibly publish his findings in academic journals. I gave him permission to keep the tablet for research purposes, though I didn't tell him about the burial chamber or the full extent of my father's involvement with it. Let him think it was just an interesting archaeological mystery rather than the focal point of a decades-long delusion that had shaped and damaged multiple lives. With the tablet disposed of responsibly, I turned my attention to the more immediate problem of what to do about the property where my father had built his burial chamber. The deed was in a false name, but the legal trail would eventually lead back to his estate if anyone bothered to investigate. The idea of someone else discovering the underground chamber and potentially getting hurt exploring it was deeply troubling. I decided to hike out to the location and see the chamber for myself before deciding how to handle it. The trail was exactly as brutal as the maps had suggested, winding through dense forest and rocky terrain that would have been challenging even for someone in good physical condition. It took me most of a day to reach the coordinates my father had marked on his property survey. The burial chamber was hidden beneath what looked like a natural depression in the forest floor, covered by a heavy wooden trapdoor that had been camouflaged with dirt and vegetation. When I finally worked up the courage to open it, I found a narrow ladder leading down into complete darkness. The smell that rose from below was musty and stale, like air that had been trapped underground for years. I had brought a powerful flashlight, but even its beam seemed to get swallowed by the darkness below. The chamber itself was larger than I had expected based on the construction plans, roughly the size of a small room with walls lined in the same kind of wood my father had used for the coffin in our basement. Along one wall was a stone slab that appeared to be designed as a platform for the final burial simulation. But what struck me most about the chamber wasn't its size or construction, it was how much it resembled a real tomb. My father had clearly put enormous effort into making it as authentic as possible, studying archaeological sites and ancient burial practices to create what he believed would be the perfect environment for testing the tablet's claims. The attention to detail was both impressive and deeply disturbing. I didn't stay in the chamber long. Being underground in such a confined space brought back all the old claustrophobia and panic from my childhood nights in the coffin. But I stayed long enough to take photographs and measurements, documenting everything before making my decision about what to do next. Update 2. After seeing the burial chamber firsthand, I knew I couldn't just walk away and hope no one else would ever find it. The location was remote enough that discovery was unlikely, but the possibility of some hiker or hunter stumbling across the site and getting injured exploring it was too great a risk. I also couldn't shake the feeling that leaving my father's creation intact would be like allowing his delusion to persist even after his death. I spent several weeks researching the best way to handle the situation. Simply calling local authorities and reporting the chamber's existence would have raised too many questions about how and why it had been built. I also couldn't be sure that involving the government wouldn't somehow resurrect the classified aspects of Project Threshold and create complications I wasn't prepared to deal with. In the end, I decided to take care of the problem myself. I purchased enough concrete and construction materials to fill the chamber completely, rented a small truck capable of handling the rough forest road, and made several trips to transport everything to the site. The work was exhausting, both physically and emotionally, but it felt like the right way to finally put an end to my father's obsession. Filling the chamber with concrete was methodical work that took most of a weekend. I started by removing anything that might be considered archaeologically significant, some of the stonework and carved details that my father had installed to make the space more authentic. Those pieces I planned to donate to the same university professor who was studying the tablet, in case they provided additional insights into my father's research. As I poured load after load of concrete into the underground space, I found myself thinking about all the ways my father's experiment had shaped my life. The obvious damage was easy to identify: the claustrophobia, the insomnia, the relationship problems that stemmed from years of systematic psychological conditioning. But there were subtler effects too, ways that growing up with such an unusual form of trauma had altered my entire worldview. I had never learned to trust my own instincts about what was normal or healthy, because my baseline for those concepts had been so thoroughly distorted from childhood. I had spent years in therapy trying to unlearn patterns of thinking that traced back to those nightly sessions in the Coffin, working to develop the kind of emotional regulation that most people take for granted. But filling that chamber also felt like reclaiming some measure of control over my own story. For the first time since finding those journals, I was taking positive action rather than just reacting to discoveries about my past. I was literally burying the final phase of my father's plan, making sure it could never be carried out on me or anyone else. Once the concrete had cured, I spent another day covering the site with dirt and vegetation to make it look as natural as possible. Unless someone knew exactly where to look and came prepared with heavy excavation equipment, the chamber would remain sealed permanently. It wasn't the most environmentally responsible solution, but it seemed like the safest way to ensure the site couldn't cause any future harm. With the physical remnants of my father's obsession finally dealt with, I turned my attention to the more complicated question of what to do with the knowledge I had gained. The military records and project documents were too sensitive to share publicly, but they contained information that might be valuable to historians studying that period of military experimentation. The personal journals were my father's private thoughts, but they also documented a form of child abuse that had gone unrecognized for years. I decided to write down everything I could remember about my experiences, creating a detailed record that could serve multiple purposes. If I ever needed to seek legal remedies for what had been done to me, having contemporaneous documentation might be valuable. If other survivors of similar military experiments ever came forward, my account might help establish patterns of abuse that could support their cases. But mostly, I wrote it down because keeping it all inside felt like continuing to be victimized by my father's secrecy. He had hidden his motivations behind military classification and psychological theories, making it impossible for me to understand what was happening or seek help from people who might have intervened. By documenting everything openly, I was refusing to let his experiment remain hidden any longer. The process of writing was more therapeutic than I had expected. For the first time, I was able to organize the chaotic memories of my childhood into a coherent narrative that made sense of experiences that had seemed random and inexplicable. I could see patterns in my father's behavior that I had missed at the time, recognize signs of his deteriorating mental state that might have served as warnings if anyone had known to look for them. I also began to understand how the military culture of secrecy and obedience had enabled his abuse to continue unchecked, even if teachers or neighbors had noticed signs that something was wrong in our household. The fact that my father was a decorated veteran with security clearance would have made his explanations seem more credible than a child's complaints about unusual bedtime routines. Writing about the experience also helped me recognize how much progress I had actually made in recovering from the trauma. The panic attacks that had once been daily occurrences now happened only occasionally, usually triggered by specific situations that reminded me of being trapped in the coffin. I had learned coping strategies that allowed me to handle enclosed spaces and dark environments without completely falling apart. Most importantly, I had built a life for myself that bore no resemblance to the isolated, fearful existence my father had planned for me. I had friends who cared about my well-being, work that gave me satisfaction and purpose, hobbies and interests that had nothing to do with death simulation or psychological conditioning. In many ways, simply living normally was the greatest rebellion against everything he had tried to make me become. But there was still one aspect of the whole situation that I hadn't been able to resolve satisfactorily. The professor studying the stone tablet had made several attempts to contact me about his research findings, and I had been avoiding his calls because I wasn't sure how much additional information I wanted to learn. Part of me felt like I had already discovered enough truth about my father's obsession to last a lifetime. However, my curiosity eventually won out over my reluctance to know more. When I finally returned the professor's call, he told me that his analysis of the tablet had yielded some unexpected results. The stone was definitely ancient, and the carving style was consistent with known archaeological sites, but the specific text appeared to be a modern addition. Someone had taken an authentic ancient artifact and added new symbols using techniques designed to make them look original. This revelation recontextualized everything I thought I understood about my father's motivation. Rather than finding a genuinely ancient source of supernatural claims, he had apparently created or commissioned a fake artifact to support beliefs he already held. The tablet hadn't driven him to obsess over death simulation. His obsession had driven him to create evidence that supported what he wanted to believe. The professor was particularly interested in the technical skill required to create such a convincing fake. The person who had added the modern symbols had clearly studied ancient carving techniques and aging processes, suggesting either extensive archaeological training or access to expert forgers. He wondered if I knew anything about my father's connections to the art world or academic community. I didn't, but the revelation made me wonder what other aspects of my father's story might have been fabricated or exaggerated. Had Project Threshold really existed as he described it? Or had he embellished the details to make his obsession seem more scientifically grounded? Had his partner really died during the overseas deployment? Or was that another fiction designed to add urgency to his beliefs about the ritual's power? Final update. The questions raised by the professor's analysis of the tablet sent me back to the military records with fresh eyes, looking for inconsistencies or signs that my father might have embellished or fabricated parts of his story. What I found was more complicated than simple lies, but also more disturbing in its implications for understanding his mental state during my childhood. Project Threshold had definitely existed, and my father had definitely participated in psychological conditioning experiments during his military service. The official records confirmed most of the basic details he had written about in his journals, including the sensory deprivation training and simulated death experiences. But the overseas deployment where he claimed to have found the tablet was much less clear. The mission reports were heavily redacted, but what remained suggested that my father and his partner had been part of a routine intelligence-gathering operation rather than the artifact recovery mission he had described. There were references to psychological casualties among the team members, but the specific details were classified at levels that made them impossible to verify without security clearance I didn't have. Most tellingly, the official report on his partner's death listed the cause as combat-related trauma rather than mysterious circumstances in an ancient burial site. The man had apparently suffered what would now be recognized as severe PTSD and had taken his own life several weeks after returning from deployment. My father's journals had transformed this tragedy into the foundation of his supernatural beliefs. This pattern of taking real events and reinterpreting them through the lens of his obsession appeared throughout his later writings. He had clearly experienced genuine trauma during his military service, trauma that had never been properly treated or acknowledged. Instead of seeking help for what were recognizable symptoms of psychological injury, he had constructed an elaborate mythology that gave meaning to his suffering while justifying the abuse he was inflicting on me. Understanding this didn't excuse what he had done, but it helped explain how someone could convince themselves that putting a child through systematic torture was actually a form of preparation for greatness. In his mind, the Coffin training wasn't abuse, it was the most important gift he could give me, protection against the kind of psychological breaking he had witnessed in his partner and feared for himself. But recognizing the source of his delusions also made me realize how much danger I had actually been in during those years. If he had ever decided that I was ready for the final trial, if his mental state had deteriorated to the point where he felt compelled to complete his experiment, I would have ended up in that buried chamber with no way to escape. The only thing that had saved me was my escape to college and the distance I had maintained afterward. This realization prompted me to take one final step in dealing with the aftermath of my discovery. I contacted a lawyer who specialized in historical cases of military-related abuse and asked about the possibility of pursuing some kind of formal recognition of what had happened to me. Not necessarily for financial compensation, but to create an official record that might help other survivors of similar programs come forward. The lawyer was intrigued by the case, but warned me that proving systematic abuse based on classified military programs would be extremely difficult. The government had been remarkably successful at covering up the more questionable psychological experiments of that era, and getting official acknowledgement would require evidence that went beyond personal testimony and family documents. However, she also mentioned that there had been recent legislative efforts to provide compensation and recognition for veterans and their families who had been harmed by military experimentation programs. If I was willing to share my story with researchers who were documenting these historical abuses, it might contribute to broader efforts to hold the military accountable for past misconduct. I decided to participate in this research, partly for my own healing but mostly in hopes that my experience might help other people who had suffered similar treatment. The researchers were particularly interested in the multi-generational effects of military trauma, the ways that untreated psychological injuries in veterans had impacted their children and families. Speaking with other survivors of military experimentation programs was both validating and heartbreaking. Many of them had grown up with fathers who had returned from service carrying psychological wounds that expressed themselves in unpredictable and often harmful ways. While none had experienced exactly the same form of abuse I had endured, the underlying patterns were remarkably similar. The systematic nature of the abuse, the scientific justifications used to rationalize harmful treatment, the military culture of secrecy that prevented outside intervention, these elements appeared in case after case. My story was unique in its specific details, but it was part of a much larger pattern of institutional failure to care for veterans and protect their families from the consequences of untreated trauma. Participating in this research also connected me with resources for ongoing healing that I hadn't known existed. Support groups for adult survivors of childhood trauma, specialized therapy approaches designed for people who had experienced systematic psychological conditioning, legal advocacy organizations working to change policies around military family services. For the first time since discovering those journals in my father's basement, I felt like I was part of something larger than my own individual story of survival and recovery. The abuse I had endured was horrible and had lasting effects that I would probably be managing for the rest of my life, but it had also given me insights and experiences that might help other people facing similar challenges. I also made peace with some of the questions that would probably never have satisfactory answers. Whether the original stone tablet had any genuine historical significance, whether Project Threshold had included supernatural elements that weren't documented in the official records, whether my father had ever truly believed his own theories about death simulation and immortality, these mysteries were less important than the practical work of healing from their effects. What mattered was that I had survived, that I had built a life beyond the constraints my father had tried to impose, and that I was using my experience to help ensure that other children wouldn't suffer similar treatment. The coffin that had been meant to prepare me for some kind of transcendent transformation had instead taught me the most valuable lesson of all: that human resilience and the capacity for healing are far more powerful than any attempt to break or control the human spirit. The basement where I had spent so many terrifying nights was now just an empty room in a house that would be sold to strangers who would never know its history. The burial chamber where my father had planned to complete his experiment was sealed beneath tons of concrete, unable to harm anyone else. The stone tablet that had inspired decades of obsession was being studied by scholars who would treat it as an interesting historical artifact rather than a source of supernatural power. Most importantly, I was free to define my own relationship with mortality and meaning, unburdened by my father's twisted theories about the connection between suffering and strength. I had learned that true courage doesn't come from immunity to fear, but from choosing to live fully despite being afraid. I had discovered that the most profound transformation isn't achieved through ritualized trauma, but through the daily practice of healing, growth, and connection with other people. The story my father had written for my life ended with me sealed in an underground chamber, either dying in pursuit of his impossible dream or emerging as something beyond human limitations. The story I was writing for myself was much simpler but infinitely more meaningful. It was about a person who had survived systematic abuse, found ways to heal from its effects, and chosen to use that experience to help others rather than perpetuate cycles of harm. In the end, that difference between his vision and my reality captured everything important about the choice between living in service to delusion or choosing to engage with the world as it actually exists. My father had spent decades trying to escape the limitations of human mortality through elaborate rituals and supernatural beliefs. I had found something much more valuable in learning to embrace those limitations while still striving to make my brief time here meaningful and connected to the people around me. The coffin that was supposed to teach me to transcend death had instead taught me how to truly live.